So here we are again. Welcome everybody with our 69th webinar. It's 4 years now ago that we started this journey. So looking forward to the next season. Of course, one of the last slides in my introduction, I will open up share with you what's ahead. Today, as my guest, I have Peter Konijn, a former colleague at the Learning Network, where I used, and Peter also used to work until, 3 years ago, around that time. We started working on test automation there. Peter joined in later, but we picked up a lot of things, and I'm very pleased that he picked up the gauntlet. More or less, I throw at him after the session I had with James Pearson under the same main title, Real Life Experience with Test Automation. And there, James and I updated each other of what we were doing or what we are doing currently. And Peter stepped in that he had an interesting topic, and that's the subtitle Testing Install Code. So very welcome, Peter. Thanks for stepping in. And I'm very pleased because it's also, I did not work on myself. So, can learn a bunch of things from you, clearly. Before we're going to start, like always, your microphone of all people present as attendees is muted, but doesn't need to hold you back from posing questions. And for that, you can use the GoToWebinar question window. And or maybe Peter, but probably Peter will be speaking more today than I am, but either of us will pick it up and give you an answer or pose the question to the other. As always, this recording will be put on Areopa Webinars channel at YouTube. Last one from 2 weeks ago already. You can see it's also on the channel already. I do my best, like always, to get it on this evening, but might be a little bit later. If you're not in the know of what is happening in the future or would like to know it much more upfront than just following the messages on Twitter or whatever you see coming up anywhere else, feel free to register to the newsletter. There will be one. No, there was one sent out already, I think. No, there will be one sent out somewhere next week. I need to wait for some input. And what's up ahead? Well, this year we're very early, or actually for the next season, very early. It's always a bit depending on how I return from summer holidays and the work ahead. But I ran into a couple of things, partly due to the Days of Knowledge conferences we had. So as the first one for the next season, we will have José, you say in Portuguese, on August 21. It's a nice topic. I was pleased to visit him or visit his presentation. Is about the parallel between building a swimming pool and how we implement Dynamics 365. Some two topics still under discussion with Camille and Arjan. On September 18, Shannon will step in with a top 10 of ways to automate, and from a more user perspective, not just technical, but also very functional things. On October 2, my former colleague Xavi will have a talk on test automation. He continued after his career at Microsoft, working on a daily basis on various projects on test automation, on other techniques, doing also webinars, etc. So I'm very looking forward to this one. We've been discussing a lot around my book, as he had been a reviewer, but well, he has got great views, so looking forward to that. And on October 16, a new speaker, more or less in our world, Tina Staric from Companion, original from Slovenia, who's going to talk about OAuth and all kind of authentication techniques. So be welcome to step in, and yes, like always, be welcome to suggest any topic, whatever. Even if you could not be the speaker, I'm very interested to know what would you like to be talked about. So before I'm going to hand over for the start to you, Peter, I would like to thank Fornaf being our sponsor, and will continue next season too. So I'm going to make you presenter right now, Peter, and the floor is yours. Yeah, seeing your PowerPoint.
Let's start from the beginning.
Your starting slide. Yeah.
Okay. I assume everyone can hear me. You can say yes, but you're all muted. Luke can hear me, presumably.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Welcome to Real Life Experience Testing Install Code, a session that is that I completely blame on Luke and James Pearson. They will deny any involvement, of course, but we will see how that works in this session. A tale of two apps, the regular feature app, the test app. So without further ado, let's meet the author of this story, which is me, Peter Konijn, 44 years old or young, depending on your date of construction. I've been coding CAL and AL since 2008, mostly at Diesel. I took some time away from Diesel for a few years, and one of those years was spent at the Learning Network in Emmen, where one of my colleagues was called Luc van Vught. You may have heard of him.
Oh, yes, I do.
Oh, good. Where as Luc mentioned, where I got a crash course in automated testing and automatic deployment, which was a very steep but very enjoyable learning curve. And when I returned to Diesel, one of my conditions of my return was that we set that up. Now, that is exactly what they wanted to do, so very little negotiation was needed. And that has been going on for the past few years. It's been a long road, and it's still ongoing. We're still improving. We have tons of pipelines and tons of automated tests. I think on our main app, we have now exceeded 1,000 tests. But yeah, we've just scratched the top. So enough about me. So let's go to the rest of this webinar. What's it going to look like? The introduction, we just did that. So we can skip that one. The story thus far, how did we end up in this session? Well, I don't know about you, but I can tell you how I ended up here. The next chapter in this story is a question, do I want to test install code, which we are going to hopefully answer. And in case the answer is yes, we are going to show you a few things on how to and how I think you should not expose that install code. Ending with, I think, a solution that would secure your install code while still keeping it testable. And then we're going to, if time allows, expand a little bit on how you would secure it in an automated build pipeline. So let's start with the story thus far. Now, I put this image, even though the resolution of this image isn't great, I put it in here because that's kind of how it felt like. Because 4 weeks ago, I had no idea I was going to do this session. I had no idea I was going to do any session, for that matter, but 4 weeks ago, I was working on a credit management app for Diesel, very far along. I had about 60 tests already for it, when I discovered that in the design phase, we had a bit of an oversight. We missed something, and that something was updating existing data, because part of that credit management app was adding a field to ledger entries, to sales documents, to sales document lines. And that field would be filled according to certain rules. And that works perfectly for new sales orders, new sales invoices, new postings. But we kind of neglected how on dealing with the existing data. Not a big thing, happens in every development process that you forget something. We went back and I started coding the install code unit to do exactly that. And I was happily doing that when Outlook very rudely interrupted me and said, in 15 minutes, you have a session, an Areopa session with Luc van Vught and James Pearson about automated testing. And of course, you know, I joined in because I'm really fond of Areopa sessions. I think they're absolutely amazing. Some apply to my situation more than others, but that's always the case. But I love the format. And I really love the format that James and Luc and the back and forth that you two had.
But are you now making up a story, or it was really happening like that?
It was really, in my experience, it was really happening like that. I don't know if you were food fighting in the background or not. I couldn't see that. But it did raise it raised a lot of interesting points, but the two that really stayed with me were two questions. And one was, which code do you want to test? Do you want to test your code automatically? And I think the right answer came out that there is no one right answer. There is no universal yes or no. It's always going to be a cost-benefit analysis. Do you want to automatically test whether an action button is specifically 2 positions on the right from the posting button on the action bar? Yeah, I wouldn't. But, well, some of you might say yes, but, you're all on mute, so I can't hear that anyway. But the same holds true for all code, I think. And the second one was automated tests change the way you code, change the way you look at code, change the way you implement code. I already knew that because, I've done my share. But those two questions really stuck with me, and because it was end of day, I closed my laptop, had dinner, and started up again the next morning. And I came back to my install code unit, and I said, well, do I want to test this code? That question came back. Because we didn't specify a test, but do I want to add an automated test for that code? Spoiler, yes. And when I was working on that, I was looking on LinkedIn. I saw the post Luc made on that session, and I commented on it, and then Luc wrote me in, and now here we are. So thank you. So it's all Luc's fault. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah, I have no problem to take the blame, but nevertheless, it sounds like your thoughts. Is it something also happening in your company this way? So that it's a typical question like, do we want to test this? Does this going to be something that's going to help us or not? Is that something that...
Yeah. I think that's a question anyone who wants to create automated tests, because as you know, and as if you haven't seen any of those sessions for the other ones, go look at that session from James Pearson. It's a very cool session. But and I think you talked about this on Days of Knowledge. I wasn't there, but I saw the title, and test automation is part of the requirements. So it is mandatory here at Diesel. You cannot request a change without a test script. So you always have to think about, how far do you test? When you start creating those scenarios, you have to think about, what am I going to test? What am I not going to test? And if I say test, I mean automated test. And there are a lot of areas that you can and want to automatically test, but there, some areas you're going to say this is not really worth the effort of. Like I said, is that button specifically in that spot? Do you want to spend half a day creating a test for it? So yeah, that is a question that is constantly asked here, and sometimes reevaluated. Even sometimes during tests, during programming the test, we go back and we miss something, like something that happened now. We missed the install.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that is absolutely something that continuously happens here. Now that we have decided it, so this is the question: do I want to test my code? And again, there is no simple yes or no answer, although it is a yes or no answer, so because it's either yes or no. But what really cinched it for me in this case was this one. If it hadn't been install code, would you have demanded a test then? And if the answer is yes, then the answer to do you want to test this install code is also yes. Because if it's that important that you want to test it automatically in your normal processes, it's important enough for the install code unit. Because an install code unit, even though it's supposedly only used once per install, especially if your app is on App Source, it is also the first real interaction users have with your app. And if that install code does something weird, that is not a good first impression to make. And one of the big pros of automated testing, and I think Lucas talked about that a lot, is that it doesn't only test your code today. It tests it tomorrow, it tests it next week, next month, in 5 years. You know, if you were to invite a test code unit for a job interview and you would ask the typical question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? It would simply answer doing the same thing. Because that is the power of test tools. It keeps testing the same thing over and over. And that holds true for install code, because your app changes over time. You get feature requests, you get bug reports, obviously not many because you're all great coders, but the app changes. And even an inadvertent change can knock something over that you don't see. And if it results in an error, especially in an install code, you will know right off the bat because you can't install it. But if it doesn't result in an error and it changes the entries, in this case, the customer ledger entries incorrectly, you might not find out until 2 years later. And your customer will not be happy with you. So in this case, since I was doing mass data changes, yes, I definitely wanted to test it. So that question answered. The next question is going to be, how? Because I was already building that that install code unit, and it was a fairly typical thing. Now, I can't show you the actual code of the credit management app, but I did create an app, a demo app, which follows the similar principle. So let's have a screenshot here, and later down the road, because I missed the slide, because in exposing your code to the test, you need to take it out of the install code unit. And if you're exposing your code, it's available to others. It's not just available to your test, but you know, it can be run by other code units. It can be run by other reports. And that is the dilemma of opening up that install code, especially for install code, and I think in some degree to upgrade code as well. It is very specific, and in this case, it does a mass change of data. And that is something you want to be careful with. So you are caught between a rock and a hard place, or as Edgar Allan Poe said, the pit and the pendulum. And Archimedes said once, in order to test your install code, you must make sure your test app can reach it. Because if your test app can reach it, then it can't test it.
I didn't know you studied classics.
Oh yes, absolutely. You have to, and all that test time, you know, when that test is running, you have to do something. And his wife replied, yes, but you also want to keep your code secure. And that is true, because especially since this is specific code for a specific purpose that can potentially do a lot of damage to your app or to the installation of the app in your customer's database, you do want to be careful with it. You do want to keep it secure, and you do want to try to avoid accidental or maybe even purposeful misuse. And if anyone ever doubts that Archimedes and this wife ever had this discussion, here's your answer. But in any case, either by not testing it enough over time, or making it open to potential misuse, will lead to either a customer or someone in your organization come back with this actual quote, which you would want to avoid. And if this is all they're going to say, and then you're lucky. But the uninstall button for an app is very close to the install button. And it's very hard to build a trustworthy reputation with apps, but it's very easy to break it. So I really think it is important to balance those two out. So we're going to look at how we do that. As I said, regular install code unit. And if this screenshot is insufficient, people can't see it, just let Luke know and we'll switch over to VS Code. But this is a screenshot of that installer. As you can see, it has very intelligent design, but it does two things. In the OnInstall app per company, it updates the customer ledger entries and updates the vendor ledger entries with a new field that I've added, posting quarter, because why not? So it sets it based on the posting date. Really not important what it does, but it does change all the ledger entries. And this is, there's nothing wrong with this. It's got the right permissions. It's got inherent permissions so that it can be run, so you don't run into any entitlement issues. So there's nothing really wrong with it, except I can't test this because I cannot trigger the OnInstall app per company trigger. And the procedures that it executes are local. So I don't think anyone is surprised by any of that. So we need to rewrite it. And this is where we get back to what we might call James's second law. Testing changes the way you think about code. And this is probably the last quote you're going to see. So don't worry. We're going to need to rewrite this. So let's go to the simplest solution and then discuss why I didn't choose it. The first try, let's just on-run with it. Because we can put it in the on-run trigger. Every code unit has an on-run trigger, and that is also true for the install code unit. You can just do this. I've tested this, as you can see in the bottom pane over here, and it runs. I'm willing to show you if you don't believe me, but it will run. And I was slightly disappointed, to be honest, because personally, I don't know what Luke thinks about it, but personally, I do not think that you should be able to call an install code unit from AL code. I really had expected the compiler to shout at me.
Fully agree.
Yeah.
Especially at you.
Yeah, of course, it always shouts at me for the stupidest reasons, but not this one. The same holds true for upgrade code. For test code units, I don't think you should be able, even if they're in a different app, but I don't think you should be able to call subtype code units. I don't know which other types there are in regular code. On the other hand, we are all big boys and girls. We have our own responsibilities, and just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you have to do that thing. I researched it briefly, and it is apparently in the Netherlands. I don't know where everyone is from, but in the Netherlands, it is not illegal to jump off the roof of your own house. There is no law against it, and most of you will be physically able to climb on top of the roof of your house, albeit with a ladder, and you are physically able to jump off that house. And most houses in the Netherlands are 3 stories. So yeah, you can do it. You're able to do it. You're allowed to do it, but that doesn't make it a good idea. So just because Microsoft doesn't forbid us doing this, I wouldn't, for several reasons. It exposes the code. As you can see, it is a public code unit usually, although I have found that it runs internally, which detracts from my own argument, but still. This allows anyone to run this code unit. Potentially, someone can create an extension on your app and run this code unit. With some clever PowerShell code, maybe, especially on-prem, or someone can use a wrapper code unit with a job queue. There are tons of security risks involved in this setup. The second argument, which I find very compelling, is that you can only test this because it does expose it for your test, as you can see, but you can only test the full trigger. So in my example, I only have 2 procedures: update customer ledger entries and vendor ledger entries, which presumably can take a long time. But you can have as many as 6, 7, 8 different procedures. And for every test that you want to run, you're going to have to run the full code unit, which can take a long time, which is a real downgrade of your test performance, which works through in the build time, it works through in all the testing time, and we want to keep that as efficient as possible because we don't have 1 or 2 tests, as I said, and this is excluding all the Microsoft tests, we have 1,000 tests of our own, 60 for this app, but we want to keep it as smooth as possible. So if I want to test whether that update customer ledger entries works, I just want to run the customer ledger entries procedure.
Yeah, and be fast. One of the goals is fast, as fast as can be. No overload.
Ideally, just to make a small sidestep, one of the things we are implementing in our build processes are build validation. So if anyone creates a pull request on our development branch, it's going to do a complete build with tests before merging it into the development branch. I've done this. I've already set this up for the smaller apps. For the main app with 1,000 tests, that takes a bit long because at this point that takes an hour to run. But for this app, this whole process will take about 5 minutes. And the reason we did that, just to clear that aside, is to prevent the development branch from blocking the rest of the process. But in any case, you do want to run that code quickly for whatever reason you can think of. So let's ditch this one. So our first try was brave. We were courageous, we were bold, we thought out of the box and inside the code unit. So let's go to the next iteration to see what we can do. Let's just make it internal. Let's internalize our problem. So let's take those local procedures that I had and make them internal. And honestly, I thought about it. I can't really get a technical argument against it because your code is still internal. So no external apps can reach it. So it's nicely encapsulated. So technically, no, there is nothing wrong with this idea. I still wouldn't approve it. So I don't know if anyone from Diesel is on the call, but if you ever put this in a code review, you're not going to get a plus from me. Because I am a firm believer in that you should use things like code units for the purpose that they serve. So in this case, we are talking about an install code unit that runs installation code. And even though you have control over your app, I don't feel really comfortable with allowing that window in to call this code unit and call functions in this code unit or procedures. See, I'm still CALing procedures in this code unit from outside it, even though it might be in your own app. It's kind of closing the window with taking out that closing the door in taking out that on run, but then putting the window back open. That's the but that's my opinion, and like I said, there is no technical argument to put up against this, and unless Luke comes up with one. Well, I take a sip.
Oh, not yet.
Okay, so the third try, the second try, we internalize our problems, but as any good psychiatrist says, you should never internalize your problems. But you should put on a brave facade. And this is mostly what I came up with, which is the facade pattern. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the facade pattern, but it's basically you put a wrapper around your code. As you can see in this top little pane here, this is the install code unit, same stuff. You might see that the permissions, except the inherent permissions, are now gone. Which we'll get back to, and you can see that inherent permissions are added here, and all the code has been moved to dedicated code units that will run that code and update the customer ledger entries. Now, this has a lot of advantages. This is a lot better. This is where I start to say, yeah, I like this. I like this. I really love encapsulation of code, and this has, like I said, several advantages. The first one being encapsulating your code. The second one also being permissions. I just mentioned it just a little earlier, and Microsoft is really investing in the whole permission structure. You've seen the inherent permissions come up. And the good strategy is to limit permissions as much as possible. Provide the permissions required, but no more. And as you can see, if I quickly move back, you can see that this installer code unit has permissions on several tables, which it needs because these are entry tables. Even with super permissions, you need permissions in these code units to write to them. Not to read, but to write. And in this case, I want to modify. But these go for the entire code unit, which kind of contravenes the whole limit your permissions as much as possible. If we move forward to the slide here, if you look at the bottom one, the permissions for the customer ledger entry are now limited to only the part of the code that updates that customer ledger entry. So the vendor ledger entry doesn't need permission on the customer ledger entry and therefore does not have it, and vice versa. Secondly, and this is a more functional change in permissions, you might notice that I have put the inherent permissions in the procedure that calls my install code. Instead of, as up here in the top pane, putting it in the code units themselves. If I had done that, I would have allowed that code unit to run no matter what permissions a user might have, which is perfect in some cases, which you might want to allow some code units to run despite the permissions the user kicking off the process has. But in this case, I want those code units not to run unless I run them in the install code. That is the only instance, just leaving out tests for now, that is the only instance where I want them to run. That also means that if you want to test with test permissions, you're going to have to add that code unit to a test permission object, which goes slightly outside the scope of this presentation. But if anyone is interested in test permissions, Luca is always looking for presenters, I have heard. Just respond to him on LinkedIn and you'll be here 4 weeks later.
More than welcome.
I thought so. I should ask commission for getting speakers for you.
That's after this session when we drink some beer.
Okay. So yes, this is normally where I would say, this is sufficient. I think you've done everything, and yes, they're still available internally, but you have encapsulated your code. And I think I haven't tested the performance. I think performance-wise, this might even be more efficient as well. But then I started thinking when I was doing this presentation, can we narrow it down? Can we just lock it up a little bit tighter so that only 2 processes can do this? And I think I figured out a way to do it. So let's dive into the hypotheticals right now and go to the lock and key. How to restrict execution. Now, there are several ways you can restrict execution. The easiest way is the execution context. This is not a widely advertised method. And the get execution context, let's see if we can switch to AL. Let's give me the facade. Let's go for the facade. Let's switch to that commit. So if we have our install code here, I can say, if anyone needs a closer zoom, just let Luke know and he'll let me know. If you want the execution context, what does it do for those of you who haven't seen it yet? So I don't have to make a variable. Let's do if get execution context. It gets the execution context. I don't know who named this procedure, but they were right on the money. And I can say if get execution context is execution context. Well, I've got some options: install, normal, uninstall, which gives me great hope for the future, and upgrade. So I can tell which type of execution I'm doing. What is executing the code? Is this just normal day-to-day execution that users kick off, like day-to-day operations like posting, like adding a line, like creating a customer? Or is this a special process that is kicking off this code? Is this upgrade code? Are we in an upgrade? Are we installing stuff? And I haven't seen uninstall code units yet, but the fact that it's here, I don't know why it's here. I haven't seen it before. Gives me good hope for the future. But we are looking at install. So I can say, yeah, if it is, or rather, if it is not install, then exit. That protects my code from being run by anything other than install, which puts me about halfway there, because that's perfect, absolutely perfect. I love that they made this to secure install code, and not just install code, but you can do it the other way around. Sometimes you don't want certain code in your app to run during install, and it's still
makes me curious now. You want to test it.
Exactly. So that's why I said I'm halfway there. So,
okay.
I'm way ahead of you, even though I'm halfway there. Yes, so this protects it, but it protects it a little bit too much, because there is a second process that we want to have run this code, which, as Luke said, and he is allowed because he is the guru of testing, is a test. And I don't have a test. I can't say execution context test. So again, if anyone from Microsoft is attending, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, add it. Maybe I'll add a BC idea for it, so you can all vote for it. So how do we fix that? How do we fix that? There is another way. So I will need this install. So let's close this up so I don't wreck my code. And let's go to stage 5 lockdown 2. And reopen this. Back to the customer one. And the second one is the get caller module info, which is under the NavApp object or type. It has an option to get the caller module info. What that does, as the tooltip says, it gets information about the extension that calls the currently running method. That's why I didn't put it in a local procedure, because at that point it would be the global procedure update customer ledger entries that called the local procedure, and it would return its own extension. But in this case, since my test is going to call this internal procedure update customer ledger entries, it will end up in the module info. So if I get the ID, which is the app ID from that module, from that extension, and send it to an evaluation, which I've encapsulated in this little procedure here, which goes to a different code unit, because you should only use code units for the stuff they are designed for. I'm a great proponent of method code units. And somewhere in Belgium, someone is smiling very widely when I mention method code units. So let's go there. And what I'm really doing is doing exactly the same here. If it is an install process, I'm good. You can run this code. But also, if that calling module ID is my test app ID, which is just hard-coded in here, and I can just get it out with that local procedure, then you are also allowed to run that code. And this is something that occurred to me later, which is also not yet, or at least not yet, in the credit management app in question. But I think this is actually a pretty good idea. If you have hazardous code or potentially dangerous code, this is one way where you can really start limiting the processes that have access to that code. And I think, we are at this point, if I switch back to our lock and key, I think at this point we are in a situation where we have encapsulated the code, we have protected the code against any processes that might run it, even inadvertently. And I'm thankful Luke hasn't mentioned the time that I kicked over 1,000 tests with one little field.
Long time ago.
A long time ago, but I still remember. And it is still available for testing. Except, and this is something where we get back into familiar territory for some, It's internal. And I can't believe none of you spoke up except the fact that you're all muted. But it's internal. So how is my test app, which is a different app, because if I switch back here and I go to my installer, which of course is, as you saw it, it calls my implementation code units, where the code is nicely and snugly interred. And as you can see, it has no inherent permissions, as I promised. It kind of fell out of the screenshot on the slide. But it is internal, because the access here, the access modifier says internal. So we need a way to access that from outside. Now, thankfully, as most of you will know, Microsoft provided that way by adding something to the app JSON. And that is the internals visible to. Now, this is a code block that is very useful and potentially dangerous. So, internals visible to. So this is a code block that allows a specific app access to anything that is marked as internal or obviously public, but also anything that is marked as internal. That goes for internal tables, that goes for internal procedures, that goes for internal code units. I don't know if you can make a report, mark a report as internal, but if you can, then it has access to that report. So basically, it is seen as part of your original app for all intents and purposes. Now, this is perfect for tests. Don't ever release this into the wild. This should never be in any code going to a customer. And if you agree with that, you're on mute. I don't agree with you. This should not go outside. This is a data leak waiting to happen, which would put you in potential issues with the GDPR privacy laws, with any other privacy laws if you're not in Europe. I do believe even AppSource Cop has either a warning or an error. I don't remember which, because it keeps popping up when I put it in. So they don't want it on AppSource either. It is depending a little on the information that is stored in your app, but it opens you up to a world of hurt, because it is childishly simple to extract this information from your app. Now, if you are under the impression that once you've compiled the app and you just send the app file to someone, they will never be able to get it out, you don't even need the actual app file to extract that information. And this is not because I'm a huge hacker or anything, but I was lucky enough, or I picked lucky, to attend a Microsoft session on directions in Hamburg last year, where they had a capture the flag competition where we were allowed to hack BC or attempt to hack BC. And this is one of the things they showed us, how easy it was. And no, I'm not going to show you. To get this information from an app. And then at that point, if you have this information, you can simply create an app, copy the ID, copy the name, copy the publisher, and my main app has no idea that you are not the actual test app. So use this, absolutely use this for your test, but also make sure that you don't put it in the release code.
Yeah, but from Microsoft side, they also say if you can evade this, do it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Be very careful.
Yeah. And the next question, of course, is how? How do we, put this in our build? Because now we're going to get to the building part, and I think we're nicely on time. It's 4:45. So it depends a little on how you build your app. Now, if you build manually, if you don't have pipeline set up yet, if you don't do this automatically yet, you will have to put it in a release procedure, which you, of course, have because there are so many steps to take. And if you have to do them all manually, you have an Excel sheet or a bullet point somewhere, or you put it on a whiteboard, I don't know. But put that in before you create the release that you are going to deliver to your on-prem customers. Take that bit out if it's in. And the other part is start using build pipelines. If you use AL code, I think you're going to go to a situation where it's an absolute must, and I think Luke will back me up on this, to deliver clean and consistent coding CI/CD build pipelines are a must. So start looking into it. There are many alternatives. We personally use DevOps, and we use ALOps for DevOps, but there's GitHub and there's ALGo for GitHub, which is absolutely free and supported and maintained by Microsoft. So there are fully, fully developed solutions as well, where you only have to do a few setups. But if you do have a pipeline, it depends a little on the pipeline you have. Some pipelines allow you to disable the internals visible to section in your app. Now, I don't know how, Luke told me that ALGo for GitHub has this feature. I couldn't readily find it. I don't have a lot of experience in ALGo for GitHub. If any of you do, again, Luke is always happy to entertain a session. Yeah, Luke?
I think it has. I haven't dived into ALGo for GitHub that much yet, unfortunately, but I recall that Freddie mentioned it. But nevertheless, even then, you could still be able to set it up yourself to get rid of it.
Of course, yes, there is always, and I'm not a hero in any kind of PowerShell or YAML or whatever, but it is possible to set it up. But if your solution doesn't have it yet, you can always request it, because they're always looking for ways to improve their product, and most companies love positive feedback. Another option is to create an internal app.json, which you call in your internal build, which has the internals to added, and in your release build, you have an app.json without that section, and there might be other ways to do it. As I said, we use ALOps for DevOps by Waldo and his team, and if you have the ALOps, as you can see here on the left-hand side of the pane, if you have the ALOps app compiler, you have a lot of settings. So you have to scroll a little bit. But at the bottom, there is internals visible to keep or remove. And just to show how that looks, let's. I haven't even opened it yet. Let's go to. I said I would, but I didn't. So let's go to our DevOps. Now this is the real stuff. So let's go to our credit management app. I wasn't lying. And let's go to those pipelines. As you can see, these are recently run. So we have the CI/CD, which I mentioned, which runs on any pull request. We have the development, acceptance, internal release. And if I go to all, there's also a release, which hasn't run yet because the app is not yet released. So let's have a quick look. Let's open this in a new tab, and let's open this here. Let's edit this. And I might have mentioned that I like encapsulation, so I've encapsulated a lot of this. I don't know how to put this in light mode right now, so you're going to have to squint. We use a lot of templates to set this up, which is all kept in a separate repository, so we don't have to redo the code every time. So you can see we have a lot of building blocks, but the one I was looking at here is the compile and publish app, which really just calls the app the ALOps app compiler that Waldo and his team made to make it a little bit simpler. It has a lot of parameters, many of which have default values. But here, the only thing I pass is the app name, which is fine, because this is the internal release. This is the release that contains everything that has been through our development branch. So it's been automatically tested. It has been deployed to the acceptance databases. It has been manually tested, approved, and only then does the code and the matching test code go to the internal release. And that internal release runs with complete tests, again, just to make sure that that release is ready to go and has been tested as much as we can do it. Once that is done, so this build does run the tests, as you can see down here. We do compile and run the tests. And once that runs successfully, we move it to the release pipeline, and once it runs successfully and we are ready in our release cycle, which I probably didn't click well enough also. edit, which looks very much the same. You can see that the tests are now missing, and you can see here this parameter, internals visible to remove. Now, I have full faith in Waldo and his team that this actually works, but I did check it just to be sure, and it is indeed removed. And that way you can still run your tests, give your test app access to your code, yet remove it from the final release so that once it goes out there, either on AppSource or to your on-premise customers, that door is shut and they can never blame you for leaving it open. So going back to that, yes, Luke?
Yeah, very nice. And thanks for putting a stress on this. This is a very important one.
Yeah. That said, and given the time, it's 9 minutes to spare. I think we timed that pretty well. We are at the end of this session, and this was basically my Tuesday that week. So thank you all for attending. If there are any questions, I don't know if there are, Luke. I didn't pay attention.
I wrote down a couple of them, but before I do, let's get switched to my screen here. So thanks for everybody. And yes, feel free to step in if you have questions. I have two. First of all, as you mentioned, let's say 2 takeaways you took from the session I had with James Pearson. And one of them was how testing changed your code. Can you give a short kind of description on how did testing change your coding, and not your individual coding specifically, but your team's coding? So the practice in general and specifically the coding. Can you pinpoint a couple of them?
Yes, of course. Well, I showed one of them, that you really have to think about how the test can reach your code and what you want to test. So if I was talking about switching the code from that one code unit to different method code units, because many of the tests we do are what you might call unit tests. So if I take that credit management app as an example, it has a lot of processes. One of the processes is calculating the remaining credit for a customer based on several settings. So, there are several different ways to do it. And one of the test code units tests those methods. So you want to test that process. So you want to test that specific process. And normally, before testing, we would have just embedded that process somewhere in the code. We would have just put it either on, maybe even in table code, but we would have put it somewhere deep in a code unit where it couldn't be reached. Now, because we needed to test it separately, and we just, as you know, in testing, or you probably know, in testing, you create your own data. So you create a few sales lines, you create a few ledger entries and detailed ledger entries just to get some data. And then I just want to run that calculation. I don't want to have to create a sales order, put a customer on it, put a line on it, and trigger that calculation that way. At least, ultimately I do, but not in this test. I just want to know, given a certain set of data, if I start that calculation, does it get the correct answer? And in order to do that, I need to be able to isolate that calculation. So it's kind of hard to describe without any visual aid, but we changed the way we coded that calculation. We factored that calculation. We put it in its own code unit. We made it internal. We made it accessible. And in our case, as I see with my team, the code is factored better.
It's easier to review, I guess, also.
It's easier to review. It is factored better. It is moved across a lot more objects. We used to have, and I think that is a very familiar story, a lot of these monolith code units with functions and management in the name, which had 20, 30 functions, back then it was functions in it. Now I see a definite move towards smaller code unit, method code units, which I mentioned, which only do a single purpose a single short bit of code and then done. That is a move that I think is maybe not solely to be ascribed to testing, but testing has moved us in that direction.
Yeah, it's a very recognizable one. By the way, now we're discussing this. Vieco has done this session before the session we did with I did with James on test doubling that highly relates to this too, and actually was part on the presentation he did on Days of Knowledge, and on which he does a workshop next week at the pre-conference workshop at the BC Tech Days. His presentation at the BC Tech Days will be about using interfaces, and actually there will be part on test automation too. So those who are joining on BC Tech Days next week, you would be, let's say, missing a lot if you wouldn't go to his session. That's often the case anyway, but this specifically.
He did a similar session on at Directions in Hamburg.
Oh, yeah.
I attended that session, and it really opened my eyes for interfaces, but also, and he mentioned that, like James did, how code is written differently once you start using that.
Yeah. And yes, I did a session on start of this season on using interfaces and in the context of tests, and this all highly relates to each other. Thanks for the answer. I had another question. With install code units, there is let's say a potential danger that install code is rerun when you don't want it to get rerun. Yeah, so every time you install the extension, potentially an installed code unit is run. How do you go about testing that handling a second run or the block of a second run is done? Do you have anything in it?
Oh yes, you can easily do that. I'm not sure if you could switch back to my screen.
Yeah, of course.
Let's see if I can find my.
And that will be the last question, probably also almost getting to the hour.
If you can see the
Yep.
Here, let's see if I can. Oh, here's the source. I think this is the latest one. This is my test app installer, which is also an install code, which I didn't need to show. So if you want to do this is the test that I wrote, and it actually works because it fails like a charm because I made it fail. As you can see here, as we would normally do in a test, especially for install code unit, because this is something I haven't mentioned, but one of the issues with install code units is that they run on install. So in order to test your app, you have to install the app, the install code unit runs, so it's already done. Now, that's not usually a big hill for testing because we always create our own data. So let's create some customer ledger entries, which is fine. Then I run the install code, which is encapsulated. It's right down here, which, as you can see, takes the install implementation, and it has access to it because it has access to the internals, and runs that code. Now, if you want to do that again, what you can simply add is another when, and then do stuff. Just you change some code. You change some code in the entries because maybe postings have been made, or maybe you make some new entries, or whatever your situation is, and then you simply run it again. And then you do your verifies to see if the correct things were changed and the things you didn't want changed remain the same. And how that happens, of course, is part of how you set up your install code. And it is a very good point because in our credit management app, I wrote this code for. The field that was added has a default value depending on certain rules, but it can be overruled by a user. So do we want to, if it gets reinstalled, you might override that change. So that's a very good point and a very good question. And this is one of the ways that we look at that. So what if we run the install code initially? First time we install the app, we expected to do the default thing. We change some entries, or we create some documents, or we post some documents, whatever is needed, and then we run it again to see if my install code, and obviously it will not work with this demo app, but my actual install code respects that manual override or not. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Great. So thank you very much, Peter. Let's get back to my screen here to thanks everybody for being here. Yes, I learned something new, so that's also worthwhile. I hope the people that were present also, and those who are going to look at the recording also at YouTube. So yeah, very pleased that you took up the gauntlets, and all compliments for a very clear story to me. So thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for being here. So hope to see you after my summer recession, probably also yours. And we will pick up on the 21st of August. Keep an eye on the newsletter coming out, and feel free to come up with any mouse suggestion. So going to stop the recording, and have a great remaining part of the day to everybody.